Welcome. Hey, Lisa.
Hey.
Hey, so Lisa's in Dallas. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. I'm Audrey. Great to see everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. We're talking about sprint planning in 30 minutes or less. You're here with LitheSpeed, and we are a premier agile consultancy based in the DC Metro, but that doesn't really matter right now because everything is virtual. We do virtual training, virtual coaching, virtual transformation work, so contact us. You can earn one SEU and one PMI PDU from joining us today. And any questions about that, feel free to stick them in the chat. So speaking of the chat or questions area, it should be in your toolbox bottom right. Can you please type in the chat, where are you listening in from today, so I can validate that you can hear me and see Lisa? And let's see where everybody's calling in from, if you call in. We've got a Houston. Hey, Houston. Maryland, Alexandria, Virginia, Richmond, Bangalore, Vienna. Oh, we are global today. Trento, Italy. Plano, Texas, New Orleans. Okay, we could go on. They keep coming in. Thanks everybody for joining us. And Lisa is here today. She is a managing agile consultant at LitheSpeed, but she's also a JIRA whiz, data scientist to the stars, and today's sprint planning expert. So here we are, and here's Lisa.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. For those of you dialing in from around the globe, thank you for taking some time out of what is going to be your evening here very shortly. So welcome to this webinar. It's meant to be very relaxed. We've got a fair number of, I'm just looking, there's about 80 people on the line. So I am going to pause at the end of every section and ask for questions, and then Audrey will be monitoring the chat. So if you do have some questions, go ahead and use the chat. And then at the end of every section, Audrey will present some questions for us to answer. So I am glad to see you all here. We are going to be talking today about how to get your sprint planning to under 30 minutes. And it does, obviously, it's not a magic bullet. It does require some preparation and pre-work, but the goal is to get you guys started on getting down to that and still have an effective sprint plan at the end of it. So we're not skimping here. We're just actually helping you guys move some of the work that you are probably doing in sprint planning to an earlier piece of the sprint. So before we get started, though, somehow just muted myself. I'm not sure how I did that. But before we get started, I am going to have you guys take a little quiz, if I can get my slide to advance here. This is a little Mentimeter quiz. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can either go to this link that's up here on your computer. Let me see if I can actually just put that in the chat. It doesn't look like I can highlight that and get it in the chat very easily. So the other option is just to use your phone and to either highlight the QR code or type in that number if you go to menti.com. So I'm going to, let's see, share this application so you guys can kind of see where you are, and we're going to give you just a second. Only 7 people have answered. While you're answering, excuse me, I'm going to go into my deck and see if I can paste that link into the chat for you, make it a little easier. Getting the chat open. Okay, so hopefully that link is in the chat.
And what we're answering, if you're not actively participating, is on average, how long is your team's sprint planning session? A couple of folks are typing into the chat, Lisa, so we've got 2 votes for 1 to 2 hours to add to our totals.
Okay. Great, looks like 1 to 2 hours is the majority. We've only had about 28 people respond, but I did just put that link in the chat, so I'm going to give you probably another 30 seconds to respond. There's 2 more questions, kind of similar, and this is just to get a sense of where we are. And I like the we don't plan our sprints. That's always a good one to know. Okay, 31, we'll give it just another second or so, and then we'll move on to the next question, hopefully. If technology, this is where things can always go awry, so that's always fun. So hopefully we will be able to go on to the next question. Maybe. And the next question we're asking is how much time your team spends on getting the backlog ready each sprint. And what I mean by this is if you know what 3 Amigos is and you do 3 Amigos, that would count. Grooming sessions count. Any kind of workshops that you have. We've worked with teams that have a daily, hour-long workshop to look through requirements. It's where everybody's talking through things, any upstream discussions you have. So this is basically all the stuff that you do as a meeting on your calendar every sprint to comb through stories to get them ready for upcoming sprints. So it might be just standard grooming sessions. By the way, if you're in a part of the world where you don't use the word grooming and use refinement instead, I will try to probably flip back and forth between those. So this would be grooming or refinement, your sprint planning session, and any other meetings that you might be having, sort of trying to hash through requirements. So we got about 32 folks in there. We've got sort of in that 1 to 4 hour range per sprint. All right, we're kind of slowing down. I'm watching the results. Okay, and finally we have, oops, we got one more. Finally, we have the last question, which is what percentage of what you commit to is generally delivered every sprint? If you have no idea, you are welcome to use the 0 to 25% option. Good, we got lots of 75 to 90%, so it's pretty predictable. That's pretty good. Only 5 of you are in that sort of target range. Okay, great. Almost everybody has responded here. So we can see that the vast majority of people are sort of in that that 75 to 90% range, but somewhere below 90% for sure. So I want to help you guys getting a good sprint planning going, and making sure you're doing all the work to go into sprint planning is really going to help you guys become more predictable as well. It's just a nice bonus that you get from doing this. So let me go back to sharing what I need to be sharing, which is our deck. And I'm just crossing my fingers that you're actually seeing.
We can see it.
Yay. Okay. So there's a couple of principles that we here that I want to address with you guys. The first one is sprint planning should not be a painful exercise. And for those of you who answered that you spend, more than 3 hours in sprint planning every 2 weeks for a 2-week sprint, know that we are working to make this a not quite such a painful exercise. It should be quick and easy and short and helpful. The next principle here is that, if I can get my slides to advance, is that it shouldn't be a substitute for grooming or refinement sessions. So we want to be sure that you're doing those things well ahead of time and not coming into planning looking at something and trying to groom it right then in planning. The third one is that it should be crisp and efficient, which you'll see here in a minute, and it should be based on realistic expectations. In other words, don't plan for 150 story points if your team has only ever on average completed 35. So it doesn't really get you anywhere. And the last principle here is that it should be discussed in every retrospective. And by that, I mean, when you get to retrospective and you're looking back on how your sprint went, include sprint planning in that conversation. Are we a group that is typically in that, 50% completion rate sort of range? And if so, why? What was going on there? Was it our estimates? Did we not plan well? Were requirements changing? And see if sprint planning might have something to do with it, and if there's anything there that you can do better. So kind of putting it all together for you guys, it should be really, really disciplined and crisp, but it should also be motivating for the team. You should come out of planning feeling really good about your plan, feeling like you're going to be able to have something accomplished at the end that's complete. There's a lot of psychology here with moving things from left to right and getting done. You all probably know how good it feels to finish a thing. And if you are continually not themes, it's a real bummer for the team. It has a really negative impact on morale, which has all kinds of other issues come along with it. So that said, we're going to go look at what planning is and what it isn't. So I'm going to start with the what it isn't, because these are just some anti-patterns that I see a lot when we're working with clients. It should not be the first time that a PO has really thought through the requirements of a thing or what the priority is. The dev team shouldn't be asking the PO, oh, well, what do you mean here? And it's kind of like the decisions and thoughts about what is the outcome is meant to be shouldn't be gotten to right then. This is what should all be happening prior. Prioritization is also needs to happen ahead of time. It also should not be the first time that a team has seen a story. So a huge anti-pattern that we've seen a lot is a PO coming in with, oh, I just thought of this yesterday. Let's see if we can get it into the sprint. And at that time, you're trying to figure out the requirements and get the story written and find an estimate for it. So this is going to be one of those things that's making your sprint planning go very long. And it's a huge anti-pattern that's going to be slowing your teams down. It should not be the first time that a story is estimated. Your stories need to come into the sprint already with their estimates on them. It is great practice to just quickly scan and review and make sure that nothing is weird, like the estimate you put on it a couple of weeks ago is still pretty good, but it really should not be the first time the story has been estimated. It's also not an opportunity to just sit and have endless conversations about what the intent of this story is. How exactly it's going to be implemented. We don't want to design the entire thing ahead of time. You should know what the intended outcome is, but you really want to have much of that stuff nailed down ahead of time. And then finally, here's another thing that I see a lot of people, and I'm sure we'll have some questions about this. We don't want to leave sprint planning assigning a story to everyone. And there are lots of reasons for that. But number one, it's not a great pattern simply because it doesn't leave you the ability and latitude to be a lean team. It will force you into having subject matter experts, or that's a very positive spin. I like to think of them as single points of failure. If something happens to them, if they win the lottery, then nobody else on the team can complete this work. So you want to move away from this model of assigning everything in a sprint to assigning the first thing that you're going to start with, and then allowing people to get to the point where they can pick up the next story that becomes available. You don't want to fix the scope for every individual person. Let me just put it that way. What sprint planning is meant to be is an opportunity for the team, and by a team, I mean your PO and your Scrum Master and your devs and your QA, to sit together and define what the goal of the sprint is going to be. This is one thing that where it can be very helpful for teams who are struggling a little bit to define what your sprint goal is. And it seems like a silly kind of addition to what you need to do, but it is very important in terms of keeping people aligned on the vision for what you hope to accomplish in the next 2 weeks. And defining your goal will then, in your sprint review, help you understand what narrative are we going to be telling in our sprint review, and it should be related to your sprint goal. Secondly, you want to identify the scope of this increment, this 2-week period that will deliver value in the form of working software at the end of the sprint. You want little tiny stories that individually may not deliver value, but grouped together by the end of the sprint will actually deliver value to the customer. And then finally, you want to craft this plan for attaining your sprint goal, and then you're going to commit to doing that plan together. So who does what? The PO, it's a lot of whether your sprint planning goes well. That responsibility is largely on the shoulders of the PO, because it's the PO's responsibility with the Scrum Master's help to maintain a healthy backlog. And what that means is you need to have a bunch of really small stories, and I'm talking less than 3 story points generally. All those stories need to be estimated ahead of time in some previous grooming or refinement session. They do need to be in priority order when you come into sprint planning. And here's the kicker, this is what makes it all work. This backlog that you arrive at sprint planning with should be small, estimated, prioritized stories about 2 weeks ahead. So this is a huge hurdle for a lot of teams, because if you're always playing catch up and you're always doing things last minute, you're never going to get ahead, and you are just going to get slower and slower and slower and slower. And that problem of not getting ahead is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. So if you come into sprint planning with this prioritized backlog of small stories that have been groomed for 2 sprints ahead, then all the work that oftentimes happens in planning is already done. So you can just come in and look at what you have available in terms of resources and people and figure out from there, well, here's what we're capable of doing, and here's what we're going to be able to do in the next couple of weeks or 3 weeks, however long your sprints are. The other thing that's really important that some people tend to overlook is that your PO needs to have decision-making authority when they come into sprint planning, because there have to be priority trade-offs sometimes in sprint planning. And if your PO can't go just be there and make a decision about what needs to be prioritized or whether we can pull this out of one sprint and stick it in a later sprint, and if they have to go ask somebody else, or if that decision can be overturned by somebody else after the sprint already starts, you need to get that somebody else into sprint planning. So whoever that person is defining the backlog, that the person with the actual decision-making authority needs to be in there. And then finally, the PO needs to come with a clear vision for what you intend to achieve during the sprint, and then that's going to feed into your goal. Scrum Master, there's also some responsibility there. You've got to come in knowing what your team's past velocities are as best you can. If you're not really tracking them, just start tracking, and you've got to start somewhere. Think about who might be going on vacation, or if there are holidays. Think about things that might be slowing your team down. For example, there's going to be a major, system-wide upgrade that's going to affect whether people can deploy code. Whatever those things are that might slow you down a little bit, just kind of have those in mind and figured out as a Scrum Master coming in. So you want to think about your average velocity for the past 3 to 5 sprints or so. And if it's all over the map, that's fine too. You just want to know what you're working with. The dev team, the development team, which we're calling agile teams now, is by that I mean dev and QA. You should have, again, not seen these stories for the first time on sprint planning day. Know what the requirements are going to be, and have an idea of how you think they're probably going to be implemented. That doesn't all have to be hammered out already, but you should kind of know the direction of where you're going with the thing. There shouldn't be any weird architectural surprises. Everybody needs to come to sprint planning understanding the risks of doing the work, what might make things go sideways a little bit during the sprint. You should have your major questions about things already answered, so this is not the time to be discussing architecture. And the tickets from the previous sprint do need to be in the right status. So that's everybody's responsibility coming into planning, is having all of your tickets from the sprint you're about to close in the correct status coming into planning. I am going to pause briefly there and ask if there are any questions from the 126 people who are online in the chat. Audrey?
So not yet, Lisa, but I did want to mention a couple of people when you asked on the Mentimeter survey, how long are their sprint planning sessions? They did say under 30 minutes. So I would welcome those folks. Please put your tips in the chat too, and we'd be happy to read them out later. All right, but no questions right now.
Great, thank you for that, Audrey. Yeah, 30 minutes for me is the sweet spot. Sometimes if you're far below 30 minutes, you're also maybe doing some things differently. Let's put that politely. So 30 minutes is usually about the sweet spot for most teams to ensure that you're doing everything, but not too much of everything. So I think there's some great things there. I'd be curious too, for the folks who are doing it in under 30 minutes, if you do have really good predictability and you've got great stories queued up, and it's just a really efficient, fast machine, and it works really well, that's great too. So yeah, tips and tricks for getting it done well in under 30 minutes are always welcome. Okay. So here's the key, and this, everything that we're talking about, getting this done in 30 minutes or less, really hangs on going into planning with a refined backlog. As I mentioned, most of the times, the reason that sprint planning is so long is because you're not going in there with a refined backlog. It's kind of chaotic. So you need to have, in order, and what I mean by a refined backlog is clear, concise requirements on every story. A lot of people use behavior-driven development and gherkins. I love, love, love gherkins for acceptance criteria on stories. Mostly that's because there's no question about what you're meant to code. There's no question about what you're meant to test. There's no question about what the outcome is going to be. Plus, gherkins do help you. This is just given when then format. If you're not familiar with gherkins, they're really tiny and tight, and they do show you where you can split stories that feel like they've got a bunch of different scenarios and might be getting too big. So gherkins are always something that I recommend as a way to get clear, concise requirements on every story and to help them be right-sized, in other words, small. Small stories means that multiples of them can be completed in the sprint. I wrote there usually less than 8 story points. If I see 8 story points, I drive really hard to get teams to split them up. There's lots of reasons for that. If you think of how lean systems work, you need small, like-sized things moving through the system usually. A little hard to achieve in a thought work environment, but it can be achieved, and you need to strive for that. Not always going to be successful, but if you start getting large, 8, 13 story point stories, you get locked into those things. There's a good chance you're not going to finish. You also have no flexibility to pivot and pick up something else. Vertical slice. By that, I mean you're doing the front end, the middle tier, and the back end as part of one story. So not a story for UI, a story for somebody working on a service, and then somebody doing some back end work. So vertical slice should be very narrow and a tiny story where the whole thing is demonstrating that the system is working. The stories should already be estimated. They should be listed in priority order in whatever your tool is. And again, I will emphasize this, about 2 sprints ahead. This slide, if you take nothing else away, is what you need to target, because getting 2 sprints ahead requires a lot of push upstream to look at what the bottlenecks are upstream. In other words, making sure that you don't have a super long sprint planning is going to force, it's kind of a forcing function for all the upstream work that is flowing into the Scrum teams, and it will make evident a lot of dysfunction that's happening there as the work is coming to your dev team. So if you can't get 2 sprints ahead, that's usually a discussion that you need to have with your product team about better planning and helping get 2 sprints ahead on these things. I am optionally recommending this, especially if you're just kind of getting started out, or your team's not hitting any kind of really good stride as far as velocity, or it's a little unclear what you might actually be capable of for a sprint. Go ahead and put a default story point value on spikes and bugs and just make it consistent. I usually recommend 2 or 3 story points for a bug. Obviously, you have no idea how big it's going to be, but some are big, some are small. Usually it kind of works out to what your average story point size is for all your other tickets, oddly. But so find some number there, and then in subsequent sprints, you'll be able to understand what your team's sort of natural velocity is if those things also have story points on them. Because if you get bunches of spikes and bunches of bugs and you don't have any numbers on them, some sprints you're going to have more, some sprints you're going to have fewer. And if that's the case, then it is really hard to take an average and have a really narrow standard deviation as far as knowing what your team's actual velocity is. Stop overcommitting, start being predictable. I'm sure lots and lots of you are familiar with the pattern on the left here. And the reason I'm laughing is that I love this, because teams just want everybody to be happy. If they can't say no, they want to deliver, they want to make the company happy. So whatever people ask for, they're very enthusiastic. But what happens is you tend to overcommit. And the more stuff that you have in progress, if you know anything about lean, you know that stuff in progress slows you down. So you want to minimize the stuff that you have in progress. Stop committing to, I think on this team, they kept committing to things in the 30s, like around 30. They have literally never, well, once they got to 11, but they have never completed more than 11 story points in a sprint. So don't commit to 30. It just it's nonsense. What we want you to do is move towards, hey, you know what? If we can do 10 story points a sprint, that's our commitment, and that's what we're going to commit to. And then you will become more predictable. You'll have fewer things rolling over. You won't have to deal with that in sprint planning. You won't have all of this stuff open and in progress, which slows your teams down. So really, 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 as a Scrum Master, this is your job, and it's a very, very, very hard thing to do for a team, is to not allow them to commit to 32 story points when they have never completed more than 11. You just have to draw the line. It just doesn't make sense. What we want is the pattern on the right, where you're pretty good about estimating and you're in sort of that 90 to 110% range of hitting plan for the 2 weeks. Also, look at this and see what's going on. This is actually a screen capture from JIRA. This is, by the way, this is, if you're using JIRA, all of this information is in JIRA. This is the velocity chart report in JIRA. So it is based on whatever board you're on when you click the reports icon along the left. You do have to do a little calculation in Excel just to figure out what your percentage is there. But this is from a team that I was working with where they were sort of hit and miss. This is sort of sprint 4 and 5 were better, way better than the ones that were previous, sort of off the slide here. But you can see that they've gotten to the point of moving from that sort of, I think they were probably in the 30 to 60% range, but also with a lot of variability. So you had no idea what they would get out the door every sprint. They started talking about their planning and their estimation and how they could improve. In retro, it just became a topic of conversation. And as they came up with ways to improve, they actually got more and more predictable as time went on. It can happen. This is real data, folks. So some tactical advice. Always have a definition of ready and a definition of done. If you don't have those for your teams, be sure to get them. Number one, definition of ready. This is when the Scrum team can say, hey, these requirements aren't clear. The story's not small enough. There's too many questions that need to be asked. You should be able to spend maybe, when you first see a story as a dev team coming into refinement session, in about 5 minutes, you should have an estimate on there that you're pretty comfortable with. If it feels like it's going to take longer than 5 minutes, the story is probably not ready. And by that, I mean architectural questions haven't been answered, design questions haven't been answered. So again, come to planning with a backlog of small, groomed, estimated, prioritized stories. Use your previous velocities to estimate scope as best you can. And then what you want to do, the technique is very simple. You have your groomed, prioritized backlog. Everything has story points on it. You know what your velocity is because, or is likely to be, based on an average that your Scrum Master has come to planning with. And you just count and you draw the line. Boom, you're done. That's your sprint plan. You can then look at it and kind of, feel through it and make sure there's, you always do the gut check at the end, but really that's all you have to do. That is how you get a really efficient planning. It requires the pre-work of getting stuff in the backlog, but you really just go in, and if it's in priority order, you just draw the line where your the scope meets your capacity or your velocity. So kind of how this works generally, sort of good hygiene within sprint planning is to end the previous sprint at the beginning of sprint planning, which is why you have to have all of your stuff in the correct status. Again, draw the line where your scope meets your velocity. Grab the first story that people are going to work on. So make sure everybody knows what they're going to start doing as soon as the sprint starts, but don't assign things after that. Leave it open and allow people to pick the next thing in priority order. Remember, they're listed in priority order as things become available and they're done with their work to pick the first thing off the top of the pile. And then at the end of sprint planning, you want to just go ahead and in JIRA, you just want to hit the button that says start sprint. If you are very model, it can be pretty overwhelming in terms of how do I get from where we are to where we want to be. One of them, there's a couple of little places that you can start. One is creating a definition of done, and that lets you know, well, what does it mean? How do we know that this thing can be closed out and considered done and not roll over to the next sprint? And you want your definition of ready, which is going to be what is your team expectation for the product team as far as when a story comes into grooming, what it looks like and how much information is in it. If, there's a couple of bullets here. So another way you could get started is just for the first time, articulate your sprint goal. That's a great, small, easy step that's within your control and doesn't have to do with any of the dysfunction that might be happening upstream. You might just start with documenting what your past velocities are, and that's your Scrum Master to just go in and kind of see how things are looking just to get a sense of where you are. And finally, one thing that I see, it's a little odd and makes it much more complicated than it needs to be. If you've got 5 or 6 teams working from a single backlog, number one, either trying to plan with all of those teams and then having all 5 or 6 teams in the same sprint. So in JIRA, it would be one sprint with 5 boards. Don't do that. Every team should have its own board and its own sprint and its own planning session. If they're all working on the same kinds of things, that will require some pre-planning just to see which team is going to be doing what, but do have a single sprint for every team should have their own sprint. Every team should have their own board and they should have their own planning session. So those are 4 little things that you can get started on that don't require an entire agile transformation within your organization. Some anti-patterns to look out for, Scrum Masters, especially this is for you. It is your job to make sure that your PO has a healthy backlog. So you need to support them and help them do that the best you can. So if that's training, if it's coaching, if it's actually rolling up your sleeves and helping them, whatever it looks like, it's your job as a Scrum Master to work with the PO to make sure you have a healthy backlog coming in to the Scrum team. You don't want to start your sprint with stories that aren't estimated, with vague requirements. Oh, we'll figure this out as we go, without really committing to, yep, we are going to do everything in our power to get this done. Or starting your sprint with, well, you know, we've only got 5 stories estimated, but usually we complete 20. So we're just going to go ahead and start the sprint and hope the other 15 kind of filter in the next couple of days from the product team. All of that's bad. Stop doing that. If you're doing any of that, just stop. You also want to keep an eye out for, and this is not just for Scrum Masters, but team members generally, make sure your teammates are engaged in this conversation and planning. Make sure at the end when you kind of do that gut check about, can we complete this during the sprint, or do we need to put more in the sprint, that you are getting a really good sense that every single person on the team is bought into the sprint plan. So if somebody's super quiet or they're not enthusiastic about the plan, call them out and ask, what is making you uncomfortable about this plan? Because you may hear some very good information that is going to cause the team to rethink what story points are in there. This may be the first time the person had said, I don't have complete clarity on that thing, and I think it's going to take a little longer than we're anticipating, or whatever else might be going on. So you want to be sure that the team is really engaged, and if they're not, be sure that you're getting genuine buy-in where people are feeling confident. And my rule of thumb is, keep chipping away at the contents of the sprint until every single person in there is about 90% confident that the sprint will be completed. Just keep, you know, you just say, hey, if we take out this 3 story points, is everybody feeling good? Meh. Okay, take out the next 3 story points. Now is everybody feeling good? It's like, okay, great. And that's your gut check. That's how you go from where you are to getting everybody on board and committed and bought in. And that's how you get to actually finishing your work, your sprint work. And then finally, this is my favorite. This is a special message to the product team. Sprints are not fluid. You are planning a sprint. The idea is that if you have changes to priority and things that are happening, likely the market is not changing fast enough that it can't wait probably 8 days before you get started working on the next thing. Not always true, but true 99% of the time. A sprint plan is a plan for the next 2 weeks. It should be sacred, which doesn't mean that it's completely unchangeable, but it means you better have a really good reason for changing it, and you better weigh the risks and the costs of changing it, and there will be a cost. So if it's going to change, you have to take out a higher number of story points than you are putting in, because you have to account for the context switching. So product team, message to you, and dev team, just because you are in the middle of a sprint and things feel like they're crazy, stick to your plan. You've got to stick to your plan. Otherwise, you might as well not have sprint planning at all. So that's my my PSA for sprint plans and planning there. Planning is very important in Agile. This is a key ceremony for the teams, and it's absolutely critical that the commitment to the plan not only come from the dev team, but also from the PO, that this is a plan that they're comfortable with and that they are going to stay out of the dev team's way as much as they can. So what does successful planning look like? Well, if at the end of the sprint, you've met your commitment, so you're in that sort of 90 to 110% range of the story points. If you don't use story points, you can use count, that's fine too. If your stuff is like roughly the same size and you're doing multiples, count can be a good surrogate for story points, but something to let you know, some way to measure what percentage of what you thought you were going to deliver, you actually delivered. So that's a number one thing about seeing if your sprint planning was successful. The second thing is, you know, have we actually achieved the sprint goal? So it's not very helpful if you said you would do 40 story points and you did 40 story points, but there are different 40 story points than the stories you originally committed to, right? So if you haven't also delivered on the original sprint goal, and you maybe are at 100% because you delivered 40 story points, it's kind of meaningless if it's a different 40 story points than you committed to each other in the business. So not only that good ratio of what you planned versus what you delivered, but also, is that stuff the same stuff you thought you were going to deliver? Okay, that's it. So that was Good fun for me anyway. I hope it was some good fun for 122 of you who are out there. But I am going to open it up now for any questions that you have. If you're not asking questions, I encourage you to do so because there's a lot of stuff in here.
All right, prioritize this backlog of questions, Lisa. Are you ready for this?
I am so ready.
All right, do you want simple or hard?
Either way.
Okay, we'll start with this one. What is gherkin? You said gherkins.
Oh yeah, so gherkin is really based in this world of if you want to Google something, Google behavior driven development or BDD and gherkin, Gherkin. It's it's that little pickle, and that is because it's related to cucumber, which is this language or framework that you can use to automate your tests. So gherkins follow a really clear format that is given, when, then. So it's given, which is your context, when, which is your call to action, and then, which is the anticipated outcome. So if you start writing your stories in gherkins, it becomes very straightforward. When I go to the ATM and I put in my PIN, then I see the screen that asks me how much I want to withdraw or whatever that is. It's so super clear what the intent is. Devs know immediately what they need to code. QA knows immediately what they need to test. And it serves as the basis for getting an automated testing framework in place because your verbs in there become methods, you've got objects, and so you just define this little dictionary, and then when you get it set up, it just goes through and it combs through these requirements. So written once, right? Like the PO writes those, devs code by it, QA, if they need to write tests, can write by it, but then it's also serves as the basis for the automated test, which can go in there and actually read the language and create and do the automated test based on the gherkin.
Wonderful. And someone would like to understand, when does the team estimate story points if it's not a part of the planning?
Yeah, that's during your grooming or refinement session. It's not that is we call it a Scrum ceremony, but it's not technically a Scrum ceremony. It's like there are 4 official Scrum ceremonies, and this is the 5th unofficial Scrum ceremony, but is also required. So you want to have a grooming session. It's usually, I'd say on average for the teams that I've worked with, maybe an hour a week, and that's the dev team and your PO. And you're really just looking through. So if you've got your stories, whatever they look like, whatever small bit of requirements that you have written down there, the PO would come to the grooming session with the rest of the Scrum team, walk through the requirements, and then as devs, you want to one anti-pattern in grooming is spending a lot of time actually solutioning the thing. You don't want to do that. You just want to have a good enough sense of what direction you're going to go when you start coding that you're comfortable with an estimate on it. So that's kind of the point of grooming. You're not really solutioning everything and writing down every single stub task. If you have major questions about how it could even be implemented, those are architectural questions that the PO should have chatted with the PM and probably the architect way ahead of getting it even into a grooming session. So about an hour a week, team sits together, they read through stuff in an hour. If you're doing well, you should probably get 10 to 15 stories to the point where devs know the work that needs to be done, and you can get a pretty comfortable estimate on it.
Awesome. I know a few folks need to drop off that can't stick around for questions, but you will receive a link to. Yeah, thanks. You'll receive a link to the recording of this webinar about an hour after we wrap up. So I wanted to throw that out there. I'll give you a breather, Lisa, and I'll read a couple of comments we got.
Okay.
Tommy has worked with a lot of teams where I was able to achieve 30 minutes around planning, but spend additional time in planning to focus on the high level how we will solve each story, and has observed that a lot of teams are not cross-functional or knowledge-based and often hit a point of contention on code standard approaches during code reviews. So we focus on the high level how and add to stories. That was the comment we had.
Yep. That's great. At some point, you are going to have to sit together as a dev team and figure out the nitty gritty of how you're going to implement it. And if you have time during planning and it's convenient and you're not interrupting each other's day because you're already all there and gathered, do it then. That's just a great time-saving thing because you're not doing all the context switching. And that's just a tip for everybody out there when you're planning your ceremonies. So whether they're the planning and grooming and retro and review and your daily stand-ups, stack them as best you can around breaks that people are already having. Have them right before or right after lunch because people's concentration is already broken. stack them up. And so you're not breaking it, you're not going to stand up and then working for an hour and then coming doing planning and then working for an hour and then coming and, doing whatever it is. So try to stack them up. And I think that's a great idea to go ahead and start having some of those implementation conversations while everybody's already in the room.
Awesome. And we have a comment from our pal Aisha. She says, I'm sure Lisa knows this, but it might be a helpful tip for everybody. So one thing she wanted to point out is that teams need to make sure things are estimated before they start the sprint. If they don't do that, the velocity chart will be off. So some teams start the sprint and keep updating story points after the sprint is started.
Yeah, so thank you, Aisha, and hi. So yeah, you want, again, if you want to be sure that you go into planning with all of that stuff estimated. You don't want to just leave stuff open and say, oh, hey, we'll start the sprint and then we'll come back and do estimation on Monday or something. It just doesn't work. And the other thing that, just to add a little a bit of context to that, if you start bending the rules in Scrum in an unhealthy way. So, it's great to bend the rules, learn the rules, bend the rules, break the rules. I 100% subscribe to that philosophy. But if you're bending the rules in an unhealthy way to accommodate some dysfunction that's going on, you are not helping yourselves or helping resolve that dysfunction. So if you can be a little firm about, hey, you know what, this is not ready. This is not ready to be groomed. No, we're not putting that in the sprint unless it has been groomed and has story points on it. What you tend to see happen is things that are organizationally wide happening, those dysfunctions become very visible and the organization starts to change. And I'm not saying be, unyielding and don't become the, the team of no, but at the same time, don't bend the rules in an unhealthy way to accommodate something that needs to be fixed in the organization. So don't start your sprints without estimates on them.
Yeah. All right. Lisa, can you expound on the risks of assigning work to team members in sprint planning?
Yeah, I'd love to. So this is something we see a lot. It kind of goes back to the cross-functional team thing where, you've got, Dev 1 can do this one thing, Dev 2 can do that one thing, and Dev 3 can do that one thing. And really what you'd wind up doing is like a combined mini planning for each one of those people individually. So you've got, Dev 1 has their sprint plan and Dev 2 has their sprint plan and Dev 3 has their sprint plan because they can't cross collaborate because, none of them can do what the other one does. So really that's this subject matter expert, it's the single point of failure kind of model, which gets teams in trouble a lot. I'm not recommending that everybody be able to do everything, but you should have some kind of survivability factor in the other skills that are required for the work that's coming to your Scrum team. So if you assign work to, if you have a team, number one, that's built like that, I would strongly recommend that you start building time into your sprint to cross-train or do pair programming or do anything that is going to help with knowledge transfer. Number two, try to break down that mentality of I do this thing, you do that thing, you do that thing, because it's very siloed. It winds up creating this sense of ownership of the code where you can't touch my thing and I'm not going to touch your thing. And that is really going to slow your team down. And then finally, if something happens to one of those people, your team is going to be completely unable to recover from that shock to the system. So you want to be sure that people are starting to learn to, again, at least have some kind of survivability factor in the other things and the other skills so that they can pick up something that comes up when it's available to do. If you think about how lean systems work, you've got this pool of things that need to be done. And then as people can, it's a pull system, right? Like you're ready to go when your WIP limit still has some space in it. And everybody should be able to pull from that system. Otherwise, you're never going to be any faster than your slowest person, basically. So that's one of the risks, is it just slows down your team. Secondly, it fosters this idea that you don't have to cross-train, and it's not teamwork. One of the key foundations here in agility is that your sprint goal is achievable by the team as a team together. Your team is responsible for making sure that the sprint goal is achieved and that the work is done. And so it should be your team working together to make sure that that's done, not this person doing their sprint plan and that person doing their sprint plan, which we're kind of rolling up and calling the team sprint plan. It's not. Don't kid yourself. You've got 4 or 5 separate sprint plans happening. And those are the more sort of agile mindset dangers that come about doing that, because you're just reinforcing a system that is slowing your teams down. And then just functionally, it's really just not a healthy situation for your teams. Sometimes you can't avoid it, right? Like sometimes you have these legacy systems. You got like the one person in the company who knows how to do it. They should still be cross-training others, but sometimes it's just kind of like, we've got 24 hours to get this thing out the door because it's a priority interrupt. I'm really the only one with the expertise who could do it, so I'm just going to do it. That kind of situation is fine, but it should be the exception.
All right, and to set some expectations here, we are not going to get to all the questions because we have so many awesome questions sitting here. I will throw out a comment from Tom. Say hi to Binky.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Hi, and happy birthday to Levi.
All right, so next up, we would like some best tips on facilitating vertical slicing an 8-point story with developers who say, we can't break this up. The actions needed to break it up from developers makes us inefficient at our job.
I hear that a lot, and I can tell you you're wrong. If you want to hang out, I can tell you why, but I would say if I had a nickel for every time a development team told me we can't break this up, or if we break this up smaller, it'll make us more inefficient. It's 99.999% of the time is completely untrue. And sometimes it is true. And again, that's the exception and definitely not the rule. It's really just a matter of thinking differently about your work. And if you've been doing things in the same way for a very long time, it feels very inefficient to do things in a different way. But I would encourage you to go research batch sizes and why they slow teams down. And it's actually quite surprising. You wouldn't think that this was true, but if you have lots of work in progress and you have large batches and you've got everybody busy all of the time at 100% utilization, you're about 20 times slower than you could be if you didn't have all of those things in place. And it's just math. I can feel very good about telling you that there was a single story in, let's see, so how long have I been doing this? Since 2012. A single story that I've seen since 2012 that actually was enormous and really couldn't be broken down any further without becoming inefficient. You do also not want to go like to the microplad scale, right? Like I'm not talking about having subatomic stories. So I would say the smallest you ever would want is to be able to to code and QA a story within 4 hours. If you get smaller than that, yeah, it is going to become a little inefficient. But I would say probably that, you should be able to maybe get 1 to 2 done a day. That would be the smallest I would go. Otherwise, you do start getting crazy, and it turns out those are usually just kind of subtasks. But yeah, I should maybe do another webinar on how to break down stories. I will prove you wrong.
And that's a great point. If you have some ideas for webinars, we had a couple ideas come out, but feel free to put them in the chat, and we'd love to take a look.
Yep.
All right, Lisa, we have someone attending who works for the federal government, and our Scrum team, including devs, is on the contractor side mainly. So do you have recommendations on things to look for, be mindful of, to ask the contractors? And this is looking through an oversight lens.
Ask them in terms of what?
Let's see if we can get a little bit more clarification on that one. All right.
But I will say, just in more generally, treat your contractors like your Scrum team. I know a lot of organizations feel like, well, why would we make sure that we're training them up in Agile, and why would we make sure that they're doing like difficult work and getting into our code, because then that knowledge is just going to walk out the door. Well, if you keep your contractors, unless you're in a model where you never really are going to have somebody, and you know that from the outset, you're never going to have somebody for more than a couple of months, just treat them like you have your permanent employees. Make them a part of the Scrum team. Teach them how to do this correctly, allow them to become a resource that can help your team get faster, because you could lose somebody that's on your team, whether they're a contractor or not. And all you're doing is slowing yourself down by not just embracing them as additional team members and allowing them the same ability to learn and grow and contribute to the work, just like your FTEs.
I'm still here, just typing away on the chat. So let's do a couple of questions touching on velocity. And the first one is just, how do you calculate velocity?
Oh, okay. So if you have, there's different ways to do it. The pretty standard way is, you've got a 2-week sprint, so that's your window. You're going into this 2-week sprint, and you're going to get some work done. And if you have story points on all of the tasks and stories and bugs and stuff that you have going into the sprint, then you just sum those up for that 2-week period, and that's your velocity. And when your team is pretty stable and the work is kind of stable and you're really good about estimates and getting your stories right sized, that velocity is going to find an average. So your first step generally, especially if you're not very predictable, is to try to find what I like to call your team's natural velocity, which is if all the dysfunction were cleared and we weren't struggling with not having great requirements and tons of unplanned work and tons of rework, then what would our team look like? And so when you start cleaning up the dysfunction, you start approaching what your team's natural velocity is. And only then, when you stabilize around this thing and all other things considered equal, then you can start stretching and pushing and seeing what kinds of efficiency gains you can get. But your velocity is basically just the number of story points. Some people do it as just a count that your team completes within your sprint cycle, which is generally 2 weeks, could be 3. Sometimes it's 1.
Great. This one's a little bit long. Let me summarize. My product is the legacy product in my company. I'm a PO. Normally I focus on fixing bugs from the software, but I do get fires. Someone gets a bug, error. So ... My question is, how can I mitigate in sprint planning the fires so that we have successful sprints and help improve the team's morale?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. What is it? I think Churchill said something about, plans are useless, but planning is essential. So that's kind of the same idea that applies here. If you are in a world where there's lots of volatility out there, so no matter what happens, that you're going to get some weird stuff that you had no idea about coming in during your sprint. It's totally fine. I mean, it's not ideal, but you can manage it. So we're not planning. We're not etching in stone what we're going to be accomplishing in the sprint, because we know there's going to be a lot of unknowns. So if you were a team that gets lots of stuff, and actually I worked with a team like this not too long ago, where their sprint velocity was about 45 story points. They could never plan more than 30 because they would get about 15 story points worth of junk, like priority interrupts and fires and things happening every sprint. So they would leave sprint planning with 30 story points, and they'd commit to that. They'd feel pretty good about that and say, hey, you know what, we're no matter what comes through on average, given what our situation is, feeling pretty good that we can commit this 30 story points. We know that we're going to get an additional 15 and just random stuff that's coming in from the side, and that's totally okay. You just have to, your predictability there is the fact that you can always deliver a core 30 story points. Then if kind of towards the end of the sprint, it looks like maybe we're not using up that 15 story points worth of space that we thought we might from weird stuff coming in from the side, go pluck something off the top of the backlog and something you can finish within the sprint and get that done. So just use the space. You just have to manage that risk. You can't plan the details, but you can certainly manage that risk and achieve a really good level of predictability, even though that that's going to happen. If that's kind of a one-off thing, like every 6 months you get this weird thing that's going to knock your sprint sideways, I would just plan on that not happening. And then if it does happen, then you just pivot as a team there and figure out what the best path forward is just for that sprint. But yeah, if it's regular occurrence, plan around it. If it's not a regular occurrence, just don't worry about it.
So we heard your Freudian slip of whisk. Do you have pancakes on the brain?
Did I say whisk?
All right. How about we do
pancakes in the brain?
Always. I think let's do about 3 more questions. I think that we're going to wrap up a little bit before the hour for people to run to their next meeting, but hopefully a quick one. Lisa, what should be the duration of refinement?
That kind of depends. It's going to be whatever it takes to get your team about 2 sprints ahead. And this is kind of the art of it. You don't want to be grooming too far ahead. And typically a sprint is about 2 weeks. So you don't want to be in the nitty-gritty details, getting story points on stories that are like 2 months out, because odds are, things are going to change between now and then. So, 2 weeks or 2 sprints ahead is kind of the sweet spot. I kind of forgot where I was going with that. What was the
You got it.
Okay.
This one, do you update story points of stories that are already pointed?
Depends when you're doing it. I'm a huge fan of this was about how often do you groom. So it's as often as you need to get to that point of having 2 sprints ahead. And you don't want to get too far. So that will define, that kind of puts the upper limit on how often to groom. Usually, like I said, the average for teams is usually like maybe an hour a week. That could be a solid hour. It could be 4 times for 15 minutes after your stand up. So you've already got that, you're already in the room together. So you just groom a couple stories in 15 minutes, whatever that looks like. But it's just whatever you need to do to get to that 2 weeks. And sometimes you have to allow time in your sprint, like set aside a couple of days to just dogpile it and get ahead. And so then we had another question in there. The second one you just asked, Audrey.
I lost it because I ask and then I delete it. Sorry, everybody. So, but I think I found a great question to end on, and I would like to invite everyone. Lisa hosts our free Agile coaching often. So those are called our Agile coaching circles. Our next one is coming up next week. I think it's Wednesday, but you'll get a link to that on the follow-up email in about an hour, LitheSpeed.com/coaching-circles. And you can just sign up and then come hang out with Lisa and ask any kind of Agile questions or follow up on your thoughts from the webinar. So very sorry if we didn't get to your question, and thank you so much for spending time with us today in this crazy time. Lisa, I would like to end it on this question. So how do you keep time restraints with a PO who rambles and is off topic?
Well, as you guys have probably gathered, I like to talk myself. And by the way, before we go, if you're about to drop off, do reach out to me on LinkedIn. Do connect with me. Send me messages if you have questions. If you need an email address to use, if it asks you, use my LitheSpeed address. It's here on the screen. But yes, definitely reach out if you're about to drop off, and feel free to just reach out with questions as well. I also kind of tend to let people know when things are coming up as well. So what do you do with it when a PO rambles? If your person is having a hard time getting to the point, that's just sort of a political thing that you're going to have to handle in a very polite way. But you don't call the person out in front of a group of people. I personally, if I were frustrated because I were trying to hear what requirements are so that I could give an estimate on it and the person is just rambling, I would personally just call them aside one-on-one and say, hey, look, I think our grooming sessions could be a lot more efficient if you came with, the requirements, and then, we're going to have a time limit on each one of these things for, we're going to set a timer for 5 minutes to discuss each story. And then if we don't have an estimate at the end of that 5 minutes, we're going to throw it in the basket, and we're just going to come back to it in the next grooming session, which is going to be a week. So I would just have kind of a conversation and help them also put some structure in place to help them stay on track with what they're saying. But also, it's very, very expensive for a Scrum team to be sitting in a room together. So if you think of all those people's salaries multiplied by however long you're in a room not getting stuff done, it becomes a little bit of a burden. So I would personally just take the person aside one-on-one and say, hey, we're going to try to get more efficient, and here's how I think we can do it, and then just set a timer. And if they ramble for 6 minutes, you're not going to get an estimate on the story.
All right, you heard it here, folks. Okay, thanks again for joining us. Thanks everyone typing in the chat. I see your thank yous, and I'm done typing, so thank you all so much for joining. Any other questions, send right to Lisa or info@LitheSpeed.com, and we'll grab those. So with that, we're going to end it. Everybody have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks again.